If you have never sat at the head of a table surrounded by 200 people who are actively calculating your time of death, you do not know the true definition of loneliness. I sat on a velvet chair that felt less like a seat of honor and more like a throne built on a fault line. The ballroom of the Grand Hotel was suffocatingly warm, the air thick with the scent of expensive lilies, flowers that have always reminded me of funerals, not birthdays. The crystal chandeliers overhead cast a fractured, glittering light on the faces of the guests, making their smiles look jagged and sharp. To them, I was William Thorne, the patriarch, the industrialist, the lucky old man who had survived to see 80 years. I was wearing a tuxedo that cost $4,000, though it hung a little loose on my shoulders these days, the fabric draping over a frame that had grown tired of carrying the weight of a legacy. My hands rested on the gold handle of my cane, a prop I didn't actually need to walk, but one I used because it made me look frail. It made me look harmless. And that was exactly what they needed to believe. I looked to my right. Richard was standing up, tapping a silver spoon against his champagne flute. My son, 55 years old, with hair that was thinning in the exact same pattern as mine, wearing a smile he had bought from a cosmetic dentist. He looked the part of the dutiful heir. He was tan, polished, and projecting an air of casual wealth. But I knew better. I saw the way his fingers tightened around the stem of the glass, the knuckles turning white. I saw the sheen of sweat on his upper lip that the hotel air conditioning couldn't dry. He wasn't looking at me with love. He was looking at the clock on the far wall. It was 11:45 p.m. Richard began to speak, his voice booming through the microphone system, amplified to reach the back of the room where the junior executives were already drunk. "To my father," Richard announced, raising his glass, "to the man who taught us all the meaning of vision, to the man who built an empire from nothing but grit and determination." The room applauded. It was a polite, practiced sound, like rain on a tin roof. I took a sip of my water. It was lukewarm. I watched Richard beam at the applause, soaking it in as if he had earned it. He talked about my generosity. He talked about family values. It was a performance worthy of Broadway, but I wasn't watching the actor. I was watching the desperate man underneath the costume. Richard knew, just as everyone at the head table knew, that the family trust bylaws, documents established decades ago by lawyers who are now dead, stipulated a strict transfer of power. At the stroke of midnight on my 80th birthday, the trusteeship would automatically dissolve from my sole control and transfer to my direct heirs. 15 minutes. That was all that stood between Richard and the billions he had already spent in his mind. He wasn't celebrating a birthday. He was enduring a countdown. He was waiting for the piñata to finally crack open so he could scramble for the candy on the floor. I looked to my left. Caroline was there, picking at her salmon, my daughter. She caught my eye and flashed a quick, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She reached out and patted my hand, her skin cold and dry. "Almost time for cake, Daddy," she whispered, "and then you can finally get some rest." That was her favorite word lately. It was her code. It was the soft, fluffy pillow she used to smother the reality of her intentions. I knew what rest meant. I had found the brochure in her purse last week when she left it in the foyer. The Everglade Manor. Assisted living and memory care. A warehouse for old people where they could be medicated into silence while their children liquidated their assets. "Yes," I said, my voice raspy, playing the part. She squeezed my hand, a little too hard. Just a few more minutes. She had no idea how right she was. My mind drifted away from the noise, traveling back 30 years. I wasn't an old man then. I was 50. I was in the prime of my life, building Thorn Industries into a global titan. I was unstoppable, or so I thought. It was a rainy Tuesday in November. I remembered the sound of the rain hitting the window of my study, a relentless drumming that matched the pounding in my head. I had just come from a meeting with my CFO. We had found the discrepancy. It wasn't a clerical error. It was Richard. He was 25 then, fresh out of business school, and he had embezzled $200,000 from the payroll account to cover gambling debts he had racked up in Atlantic City. I hadn't called the police. I hadn't screamed. I had just felt a cold, hollow ache in my chest. Then, the very next week, the call came from the bank in Aspen. Caroline. She had forged my signature on a deed to buy a condo she couldn't afford, trying to impress friends who didn't care about her. I sat in that study in 1995, looking at the rain, and I realized the truth. I hadn't raised children. I had raised parasites. I had raised two people who looked at me and saw a resource to be mined, not a father to be respected. The grief I felt that night was worse than any business loss. It was the grief of a gardener who realizes the roots of the tree are rotten and they are going to destroy the foundation of the house. Raising children is like planting trees. You hope for shade, you hope for fruit, but sometimes, if you aren't careful, the roots grow wild and strangle everything you built. I looked at Richard raising his glass again, laughing too loud at a joke that wasn't funny, and I felt that same ancient sadness wash over me. If you are listening to this, if you have built something you are proud of, whether it's a business, a home, or a savings account, protect it. Don't assume your bloodline carries your values just because they carry your name. Don't let guilt make you vulnerable. Subscribe to this channel because the plan I am about to execute is the only insurance policy that actually pays out when the people you love decide you are worth more dead than alive. I reached into the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket. Richard's eyes darted toward the movement, suspicious. He was jumpy. He thought maybe I was reaching for a checkbook or maybe my heart medication. I pulled out my tablet. It was a sleek black device, incongruous with the old-world setting of the ballroom. Richard chuckled, leaning into the microphone. "Look at that, everyone. 80 years old and he's checking his stocks." Laughter. Polite, sycophantic laughter. I wasn't checking stocks. I unlocked the screen. It was connected via a secure, encrypted line to the central server of my holding company. The interface was simple, a stark black screen with a single prompt glowing in white text, awaiting biometric confirmation. I glanced at the clock. 11:50 p.m. 10 minutes. I looked at the guests. I saw the board members who had been pushing for my retirement. I saw the friends who only called when they needed capital for a venture. I saw a room full of vultures circling a carcass that wasn't quite dead yet. Richard sat down, wiping his forehead with a napkin. He leaned close to me, his breath smelling of scotch and desperation. "Great turnout, Dad," he said. "They are here for the champagne, Richard," I said softly. He stiffened. "I think you do," I said. "I know about the loans, Richard, the private lenders, the $6 million you borrowed against your future inheritance." Richard went pale. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like a magic trick. "I know everything," I said. "I'm the CEO." He swallowed hard. "Dad, listen, it's just a bridge loan. Once the transfer happens tonight, I'll clear it. It's business." "Gambling isn't an investment, Richard," I said. He opened his mouth to argue, but the DJ interrupted. The voice boomed over the speakers. "We are approaching the witching hour. Let's count it down for Mr. Blank." The room began to buzz. A chant started. 10. Caroline grabbed my arm. "Here we go, Dad." They weren't counting down to my birthday. They were counting down to my obsolescence. They were counting down to the moment I became a line item in a budget they controlled. 8. I looked down at the tablet. My thumb hovered over the sensor. Back in 1995, I had written a document, a protocol. I had buried it so deep in the corporate archives that even the highest-paid auditors hadn't found it. It was a sleeper cell of legal code set to activate only on the condition of my survival to this specific date. It was a dead man's switch, but for a living man. 6. Richard looked at me. He was practically vibrating with greed. He raised his glass again, his eyes locked on the clock. He was already spending the money. He was already buying the boat, paying the shark, hiding the evidence. 4. I looked at them one last time. My children. I loved them once. I loved the idea of them. But I loved my dignity more. 2. The room roared. Balloons dropped from the ceiling, a cascade of gold and silver. Confetti cannons fired. The noise was deafening. Richard and Caroline grabbed each other's hands, a victory squeeze they thought I didn't see. They smiled, genuine, predatory smiles. They thought they had won. I pressed my thumb against the glass screen. The tablet vibrated. A green bar swept across the black background. Identity confirmed. Protocol 1995 initiated. Asset reallocation complete. I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had worn all night. It felt good. It felt like laying down a heavy pack after a 50-mile march. Happy birthday, I said to myself, my voice lost in the applause. I closed the cover of the tablet. I stood up. Richard moved instantly to help me. He grabbed my elbow, his grip firm, guiding me. "Okay, Dad, let's get you to the car. You must be exhausted." He was trying to guide the old man to the exit so the real party could start, so the lawyers could come in. I brushed his hand away. I didn't do it gently. I shoved his arm aside with a strength that surprised him. He stumbled back a step, looking confused. "I don't need your help, Richard," I said. I picked up my cane, but I didn't lean on it. I held it like a scepter. "I'm going to the study upstairs," I announced. My voice wasn't amplified, but it cut through the noise near the head table like a knife. "Dad, it's late," Richard said, his eyes narrowing, his patience fraying now that he thought he owned me. "The lawyers are meeting us tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to sign the transfer papers." I looked him dead in the eye. I let the silence stretch between us, letting him feel the weight of it. "There will be no meeting, Richard," I said. "What? Of course there is. The trust transfer's at midnight." "The transfer happened 30 seconds ago," I said, calmly. Richard froze. Caroline stopped mid-clap. The people closest to us turned, sensing the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. "Caroline," whispered. "I'm talking about 1995, I said. I turned and walked away. My cane clicked rhythmically on the marble floor. Click, click, click. A metronome of judgment. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I left my children standing in the ruin of a future they had spent 30 years spending, surrounded by balloons and champagne, while the ground beneath their feet turned to dust. Silence is a luxury that only the truly powerful can afford. I sat behind the heavy oak desk in the private study of the hotel suite, listening to the hum of the air conditioning and the distant, muffled bass of the music from the ballroom 2 floors below. That desk had traveled with me for 40 years. It was scarred with cigarette burns from the 70s, ringed with coffee stains from the 80s, and scratched by the pens of lawyers who had tried and failed to take my company in the 90s. It was a fortress of wood and varnish, and tonight it was the judge's bench. I placed my cane against the side of the leather chair. I adjusted my cufflinks. I waited. I didn't have to wait long. 5 minutes after I had walked away from the head table, the door to the suite flew open. It wasn't opened, it was breached. There was no knock, no hesitation, no respect. Richard and Caroline burst into the room like oxygen rushing into a fire. They were out of breath. Richard's tie was loosened, pulled to the side like a noose he was trying to slip. Caroline's face was flushed, her perfect makeup beginning to crack around the eyes where the panic was seeping through. They didn't look like grieving children concerned for their elderly father's health. They looked like junkies who had just been told the pharmacy was closed forever. "Richard," demanded, slamming the door shut behind him with a force that rattled the framed prints on the walls. He marched toward the desk, his finger pointing at me, shaking. "What did you mean, the transfer happened? That's impossible. The trust bylaws, I know them by heart, Dad. At midnight on your 80th birthday, the trusteeship automatically reverts to the direct heirs." He slammed his hand on the desk. "You can't change it now," he shouted, his voice cracking. "It's too late. You're 80 years old. If you tried to change the terms tonight, we will contest it. We will claim incompetency." I looked at him. I looked at the sweat beading on his forehead. I looked at Caroline, who was standing by the door, wringing her hands, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for a hidden camera. "Sit down," I said. I didn't shout. I didn't tremble. I didn't use the wavering, raspy voice of the old man they had toasted downstairs. I used the voice that had broken unions and silenced boardrooms. It was a voice of granite and steel. They froze. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. They had walked in expecting a confused geriatric. They had found the CEO. Richard blinked, confused by the sudden return of the father he hadn't seen in a decade. He pulled out the chair opposite me and sat heavily. Caroline perched on the edge of the sofa, looking small. "Dad," Caroline started, her voice whining, "we're just worried. You said something crazy downstairs about the money going somewhere else." "I have never been more serious in my life," I said. I opened the top drawer of the desk. My movements were slow, deliberate. I reached inside and pulled out a single thick envelope. The paper was bonded cotton, heavy and textured, the kind they don't make anymore. It had yellowed around the edges, aging just as I had. On the back, it was sealed with red wax, the seal brittle and cracked with time. "I placed it in the exact center of the desk," I asked. Richard stared at the envelope. He looked at the date scrawled on the front in my handwriting, November 14th, 1995. "It's a letter," Richard scoffed, wiping his mouth. "So what? Is this another one of your lessons? Another sermon about the value of $1? We don't have time for this, Dad." "It is a contingency," I corrected him. "I wrote this letter the day after you forged my signature on the Aspen deed, Caroline. Do you remember that?" Caroline flinched. She looked down at her lap. "And it was written exactly 1 week after I covered your gambling debts in Atlantic City, Richard," I continued, turning my gaze to my son. $200,000 stolen from the payroll account. I didn't call the police then. I didn't send you to jail." "Richard," shouted, throwing his hands up. "My God, Dad, ancient history. I was a kid. You're going to hold that against me now?" "You have done nothing for the company, Richard," I said calmly. "You have occupied an office. You have drawn a salary. You have attended lunches." I picked up the heavy brass letter opener. I slid it under the flap of the envelope. The sound of the tearing paper was loud, violent, like a bone snapping in a quiet room. I unfolded the document. It was a single page, typed on an old typewriter. "This letter contains instructions for the dissolution clause embedded in the original trust," I said, smoothing the paper on the desk. There is no dissolution clause, Richard stammered, his face losing color. I've read the trust. You read the version I let you see, I said. The redacted version. The real trust, the one that controls the primary assets? I adjusted my glasses. I looked down at the words I had written when I was a younger, sadder man. The clause is simple, I read aloud. The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard exploded, standing up and knocking his chair over. That's bullshit. You can't prove we lack affection. We love you. We threw you a goddamn party. A party charged to my corporate card, I counted dryly. A party where you spent the entire night checking your watch. Do you think I'm blind, Richard? Do you think I'm deaf? I heard you in the hallway last week. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. You are done, I continued, relentless. Richard, let's talk about the loans. Not the bank loans, the private ones. The ones with interest rates that are illegal in 40 states. You are $6 million in debt to people who break legs for a living. He grabbed the edge of the desk, swaying slightly. Dad, you don't understand. It was an investment. It was a gamble, I said. I turned to Caroline. She was weeping now, black mascara running down her cheeks in rivers. And you, sweetheart, I said, my voice softening but losing none of its edge. You mortgaged your house 3 times. 3. You are living on credit fumes, buying purses you can't afford to impress people who laugh at you behind your back.
I'm your daughter,
she whispered, her voice trembling. How can you do this? Where does the money go? You can't just... I picked up my tablet. I tapped the screen, bringing up the confirmation receipt. I executed the transfer at midnight, I said. Protocol 1995. I turned the tablet around so they could see the screen. The balance was 0. It is a charitable trust, I explained. It builds trade schools. It funds scholarships for kids who grew up like I did, poor, hungry, and willing to work. It does good work. It creates legacy. Richard choked out. The reality was finally hitting him. He looked like he had been shot. All of it? I kept enough for myself, I said calmly. I have my pension. I have this suite paid for until I die. I have my dignity. But the empire? The power? The billions? Yes, it's gone. It belongs to the public now. The board of directors was notified at 12:01. Richard sank back into the chair, putting his head in his hands. He began to rock back and forth. I owe them money, Dad. Dangerous people. If I don't pay tomorrow, they'll kill me. Then I suggest you call the police, I said, or get a job, like I did when I was your age. This is cruel, Caroline wept, pulling at her pearls. You're a monster. I stood up. I grabbed my cane. I felt taller than I had in years. I didn't do this to you, I said, my voice filling the room. You did this to yourselves. I gave you 30 years. 30 years to prove me wrong. 30 years to build something of your own. 30 years to show me you loved me, not my wallet. I walked around the desk. I stood over them. You failed every single day. Richard looked up at me. His eyes were red, terrified, and full of hate. I hate you, he hissed. I know, I said. You've hated me since the day I made you mow the lawn. I walked to the door of the study. My hand hovered over the brass handle. I paused and looked back at them one last time. 2 middle-aged children who had never grown up, sitting in the wreckage of their expectations, drowning in the consequences of a lifetime of entitlement. Happy birthday to me, I said softly. I opened the door and walked out. I walked through the quiet hallway, leaving the door open behind me so the sound of their weeping could spill out into the corridor. I took the elevator down to the lobby,
the descent feeling like an ascension. I walked out the front doors of the Grand Hotel. The doorman, a man named Eddie who had worked there for 20 years, tipped his hat. "Good night, Mr. Thorne," he said. "It is, Eddie," I said. I hailed a taxi. The night air was cold, biting against my skin. But for the first time in 30 years, I didn't feel the weight of the crown. I wasn't the king of industry anymore. I wasn't the target. I wasn't the bank. I was William Thorne. I was 80 years old.
And as the taxi pulled away from the curb, leaving the parasites behind, I realized I was finally free.